I found out they're not my kids, so they're no longer my problem. The day I found out the truth about my kids, I was sitting in my car, outside the courthouse, holding the paternity test results. My hands were shaking as I read the words. None of the children, neither my 6-year-old son nor the newborn, were mine. I read it over and over, but the words didn't change. For a long time, I had this nagging doubt in the back of my mind, a whisper telling me something was off. But I pushed it away and buried it under a mountain of denial because the alternative was too painful to consider. My wife, my best friend, the woman I trusted more than anyone in the world, had lied to me, and not just a small lie. This was a life-altering, soul-crushing lie. I felt a deep sense of betrayal. The life I thought I had, the family I thought I was building, it was all based on a lie. I didn't know how to process it. I thought about my son, the little boy I had raised as my own. I remembered the day he was born, the overwhelming joy I felt. And then I thought about the newborn, a little girl I had yet to form a bond with, but who I had been ready to love unconditionally. But they weren't mine. The thought kept repeating in my head. I wasn't their father. Not really. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it all. The idea of going home, facing my wife, and pretending like everything was normal seemed impossible. But I couldn't stay in that car forever. Eventually, I started the engine and drove home. I walked in, and my wife greeted me with a smile. She didn't know I had the results. She didn't know that I knew. Looking at her, I felt a mix of sadness and anger. How could she do this to me? To us? I didn't confront her right away. I needed time to think, to plan my next steps. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. I told him straight, I wanted divorce. I just wanted out. Telling my wife was harder. I waited until the evening, when the kids were at her mother's. I didn't want them to see this. When I told her, she tried to deny it at first, then started crying and begging me to reconsider. But I had made up my mind. I couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies. The next few days, I moved out and stayed with a friend. I needed space, away from the house. My feelings towards the kids, especially my son, were complicated. I loved him. He was my son in every way that mattered, except biologically. But every time I looked at him after knowing the truth, I felt this twist in my stomach. It wasn't his fault, and I hated myself for feeling that way, but I couldn't help it. The love was still there, but it was tangled up with all these other emotions: betrayal, anger, sadness. It was a mess. I avoided places we used to go to as a family. I couldn't bear running into someone who knew us, who would ask about my wife and kids. I felt like everyone was judging me, whispering behind my back. It was suffocating. The divorce proceedings were straightforward since my lawyer was good. My wife called several times, sometimes angry, sometimes crying. I didn't answer. It was a tough day. The day I decided to tell my son the truth. He was there, playing on the floor with his toy cars, arranging them in neat little rows. He looked up when I sat down beside him, his face lighting up for a second before he seemed to sense something was wrong. I took a deep breath. This was hard. I needed to tell him his mom and I were splitting up. I wasn't sure how to say it, but I just started talking. I explained that sometimes parents don't live together anymore. He looked confused, maybe a little scared, but he was listening. Then came the hardest part. I had to tell him I wasn't his biological dad. I tried to keep it simple. I said that sometimes a kid's dad is someone who loves them a lot, even if it didn't help make them. He looked at me, trying to understand. I could see he was processing it, trying to make sense of what I was saying. He asked me then, "So, are you still my dad?" That question was tough. I told him I'd always care about him, but things were going to change. He didn't cry or get upset. He just seemed kind of lost and went back to playing with his cars. I stayed there for a while, just watching him play. I knew our relationship was going to be different after that talk. When I left the house that day, I felt empty. I knew I did the right thing by telling him the truth, but it didn't feel good. It felt like I'd lost something important. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, feeling out of place. He explained that we would need to file for disestablishment of paternity. This wasn't a term I'd heard before. He told me it's a legal process to show that I am not the father of the kids. This was necessary to avoid child support for kids that weren't mine. The lawyer outlined the steps we needed to take. First, we had to file a petition with the court. This meant filling out a lot of forms. I had to provide details about my marriage, the kids, and the paternity tests. Next, he talked about the court hearing. We would have to go in front of a judge to present our case. The thought of sitting in a courtroom, talking about my personal life, wasn't something I was looking forward to. But the lawyer assured me it was just part of the process. He warned me it wouldn't be easy or quick. The thought of going through all this made me feel a mix of relief and frustration. I was doing something about the situation, but I was also angry that I had to deal with this at all. The lawyer mentioned that my ex-wife might fight the petition in court. That thought was unsettling. I didn't want to see her again, let alone argue in front of a judge. I signed the papers he gave me. The lawyer said he'd take care of most things, but there were parts I'd have to face myself. It was a Sunday when I told my family about everything. We always had dinner at my parents' house on Sundays. My mom was busy in the kitchen, and my dad was sitting in the living room, reading his newspaper. Everything seemed normal, but for me, everything was different. I sat down at the dinner table. Nobody was talking much. I decided to just start telling them everything about the paternity tests, the affairs, and the divorce. I kept my eyes down, mostly looking at my plate,